Good afternoon. What I'm most proud of, actually, is that at my advanced age, I still spend 2 hours a morning working out with the Harvard football team. So that's the most proud I am. Here, how many of you actually want to change the world? It's okay. You can raise your hands. You don't have to be like this. Okay. How are you going to change the world? You. Oh, but that was rude. You're right. I'm Roland. How are you going to change the world? Awesome. You guys went simultaneously on the hand, so I'll go both. What about you? Astronaut and learn more about space. Sorry, the lights are super in my face, so I can't really see upstairs, but anyone upstairs want to change the world? There we go. Wow, that's cool. Build robots. That's amazing. A million years ago, when I was your age, I also wanted to change the world. I wanted to go to the NFL. Well, let me rephrase that. I wanted to change my world. Maybe that could have some spillovers to other people. But, and I was interested in two things. I wanted to wear T-shirts to work. I thought that would be cool. And I wanted to have a room full of shoes. I don't know what the second one's about, but and to be clear, I've accomplished both of them. But I really wanted a room full of shoes. Now what I do for a living is that I raise lots of private resources to run programs in communities across the United States. And I'm an economist, but I'm interested in racial inequality, right? That's like a little bit of a weird thing. That's like an oxymoron, like jumbo shrimp or something. That's weird, right? Like economists, we're really careful and analytical, but caring about other people is not typically our thing. But what I do, I love the economic method, right? I really love, like when I was in graduate school, I got totally fascinated with the tools, right? Like, the separated hyperplane theorem. I was just blown away with the beautiful mathematics of economics. And I thought it was being used to study problems that were not as interesting to me, right? Like the optimal cake eating problem. You see my size. I'm 6'2", 215. I eat the whole cake. But I thought maybe these things can be used on problems that I deeply care about, right? Like why all the kids in my neighborhood, not a lot of them went to college, even though I thought they had great talent. Why many of my friends ended up incarcerated at young ages, even though I thought there was a lot of potential. And so what I do is I go around and we raise a lot of dollars. We've probably raised a couple $100 million at this point over the last 10 years to run experiments. That's the economist in me, right? I don't tie my shoes without a treatment and control group. But to run experiments so that we can really understand what works and what doesn't, with the idea that we want to lower inequality in America by expanding opportunity. There's a thing here somewhere, isn't it? So I'm going to show you a project I've been working on for the last year and a half. It hasn't made me the most popular, and that's what happens sometimes when you're dealing with big data. Sometimes you get answers that aren't what you expected when you started. Like many of you, I was really, and I am really, concerned with what's going on between race and police in communities across America. Right? It started with, I shouldn't say it started with, it became more salient for us with Michael Brown in Ferguson, Eric Garner in New York City, Laquan McDonald in Chicago. I could go on. And I was frustrated by this, to be honest with you. I was tired of looking at my TV at night and seeing protests and silly debates. They weren't silly in their content, they were silly in their execution about what was actually going on. And as you might imagine, I'm kind of too weak to be protesting. I mean, it's like hot out there. So I decided maybe what I should do, my skin's too fair for that. But what I can do is go into our lab and roll up our sleeves and see if we can actually make progress. Okay? And so the key thing was like, how do you make progress on something that is so deeply emotional? right? People on both sides of this issue are deeply emotional about it, and rightly so. So here's what I did. I'll just tell you the full story. I called up Bud Riley, who turns out to be the police chief of the Harvard University Police. And I said, hey, Bud, I'm interested in race and police, but I gotta be honest with you. I spent my youth running from dudes like you, right? So I don't really like you all that well, but I'd like to learn. And Bud said, I got just the thing for you, okay? True story. So Bud says, why don't you come over to my office tomorrow at 3 o'clock, and I got something for you. I said, oh, okay, Bud, but like, you know, my grandmother always taught me not to just go hang out with police, right? This seems like a setup. So so I brought one of my white students with me, and I was like, come on with me, you can film this. Okay, that's actually not true. That's not true. That part's not true. If I thought about it first, it would have been true, but it's not true. I risked it. I went and had coffee with Bud in the afternoon, and Bud took me to the simulator. So I went into the police simulator where they actually train police officers, because I thought this was easy, right? Because, you know, I got like this fancy European wife who's like, why don't they just shoot him in the leg? And I'm like, well, I don't know. Why don't they just shoot him in the leg? So I go over, and he puts on the utility belt. Like, I'm going deep in here. This is like, now I'm into sociology, right? 'Cause I got the utility belt on, I've got my pistol on, I've got like my night light or whatever police have. I got that stuff on. And I'm in this kind of simulator where bad guys are jumping out, and you've got to decide who to shoot. Okay. So my first interaction, I only have 10 minutes, so I can't bore you with all of them. Bottom line is I'm the worst police officer ever imaginable, but the first guy comes up, true story, and it's a, I don't know, mid-40s, maybe 50, white gentleman, long hair. And I'm going to a suburban pool party because there have been complaints. And so I get there, and this person is clearly inebriated and is a little handsy. You know, he's, why are you bothering me? What are you doing? And so I get a little nervous, even though I'm in the simulator. And the simulator has got some artificial intelligence parts to it, so as I talk him down using de-escalation techniques, this image on the screen is supposed to relax. So I say to him, sir, I'm just doing my patrols here. You gotta relax. He says, well, you're always bothering me. I said, sir, I'm talking to the screen now. You gotta relax. And he puts his hands in his pocket, and I decide that's enough for me. So I pull my gun on the guy. Bud turns on the lights. Professor, what are you doing? I was like, isn't that what y'all do? Could have fooled me. And so we go through this training, and I have to say, all seriousness, it was not just the training, but this whole experience. I think I learned, it was the most important lessons I'd learned in life since my grandmother taught me how to read. It turns out police have a really tough job. And so my next thing was I learned how to shoot police-issue weapons just because I wanted to understand. And then I actually embedded myself in the Camden Police Department. Now, I know the police chief here in Boston, and I highly recommend anyone do a ride-along with police just to understand their side of the story. I do not recommend riding along, embedding yourself in Camden, New Jersey. Okay, it was a crazy experience. We were responding to 911 calls. We were responding to shots fired, right? Now, all of us thinkers, if there's some shots over here, our way to respond is to go over here. But it turns out when you're in the police car and they like start shooting, you got to go in there, right? And it was an unbelievable experience. And in part because I got to say, I'm not proud of it, but I would say it took 5 to 6 hours to get pretty desensitized. And because you're always seeing people in crisis. And that's not a part of policing that I ever thought about, right? You show up to a Wendy's and someone has threatened the cashier and you show up 3 hours late because like the Wendy's threatening thing was way down on your list of things to show up for. And you get there and you get yelled at for 30 minutes and you end up saying something nonsensical like, if they come back and threaten again, call us. give us a 3-hour window. You know, I mean, like, it was incredible. And so I did all this because I wanted to do a few things. One, I'm going to show you some data in a second. I wanted to learn how to talk cop. That was important. I wanted to build trust with police departments. And most importantly for an economist, I needed some data. And so what we've done is we have collected now, in places like New York City, 6 million data observations over the last 15 years on use of force that ranges anywhere from policemen putting their hands on you to hitting you with a baton. We've also worked with lots of cities, Houston, Arlington, Austin, most counties in Florida, Boston, Camden, to collect data on officer-involved shootings. Okay? Because it's not enough, and you guys know this from high school statistics, it's not enough to just look at, numbers of people who are being shot. That's also awful, but that's not enough statistically. What you really want to understand is, in a similar situation, does race impact the probability of a police officer pulling the trigger? That's a very different question. And that question, the burden of the data is strong, because you need to understand all of the police shootings that could have happened but didn't. That's far more complicated. In fact, just in one city alone, we spent 50 minutes per observation, hand typing them in the police department because he didn't trust us to leave with the data. We had to pay a sergeant $50 an hour to watch us type in the data. Okay? And we typed in roughly 2,000 observations. Took us nearly a year. Here's what we found. This is the odds ratio for blacks versus whites, so anything over 1 shows a racial difference. On the x-axis here, I have the amount of force used, yeah? So 1 is hands, 7 is baton. This is the same for Hispanics. On the y-axis is the odds ratio. Anything over 1 means that Hispanics are more likely to have that use of force. And on the x-axis, it's the same. These are uses of force. Okay? Now this is important because a couple reasons. One, we usually don't have data on uses of force. Particularly like, do you put your hands on someone? We even have data that I can't show you today because of time, where I know just if the police officer shouted at you. Okay? And so what you find here is something pretty interesting. When it comes to any force being used, blacks are 53% more likely to have any force used on them in any interaction with police. Now, this is reported by the police, right? So maybe this is an underestimate, maybe it's not, but it's reported by the police. This is not people complaining on a survey. This is administrative data from the police. As the use of force increases, the racial difference remains pretty constant at about 25%. Here's a pretty interesting fact. Even when you look at individuals who are perfectly compliant as reported by the police, perfectly compliant, not arrested, they don't have contraband, there is nothing in the record to show that any ill was done. The racial differences in whether or not force was used in that interaction is roughly 24%. Okay? So there are large racial differences between Hispanics and African Americans in the US on lower level uses of force that I cannot explain with the data. And many, many police departments, as I've talked to them about this over the last few months, agree with this. They understand. Some police departments, sometimes when you get into more rural areas, to be very blunt about it, don't like the, they don't want to debate with these data. But the vast majority of them understand that there may be an issue on the use of force. What's interesting, however, is that when you actually look at police shootings, we find no racial differences. We find racial differences in the numbers, right? More African Americans are shot by police than whites, but not once you actually take more context into account, okay? So this is where we went to places like Houston and others and collected very, very detailed data on racial differences in officer-involved shootings. Now, here's a very important caveat. We don't have every city, yeah? We don't have Chicago. I'd love Chicago. We don't have Chicago. They won't give it to me. I've asked many times. After we released this paper, myself and a couple of the folks who started the Black Lives Matter movement met with President Obama for 5 hours in the White House. 5 hours. And after it was over, that's a long time to meet with the president, and frankly, I had to pee, and what do you do? Like, Mr. President, like, that's one of the big issues of that meeting. I was sitting there like, Mr. President, that's really interesting, man. Finally, this is true, I asked Loretta Lynch, I have a little handwritten note that I wrote to Loretta Lynch, like it's the first interaction you have with her. You want to be really good and bold, and like, this is the thing my grandmother prepared me for, and my little note says, where do I pee? Anyway, so we met, and we debated this a lot, and I asked him, I said, Mr. President, he said, is there anything the White House can do to further this research? I said, you can get me data from Chicago. He said, is there anything else the White House can do? So we don't see it. We don't see it whether it's on the shootings. So we look at similar situations in the data and calculate the times where shooting could have taken place but didn't. We don't see it there. Houston has a really interesting thing because on the strong arm in Houston, there is a pistol. On the weak arm, there's a taser. So we can actually, in economics lingo, that's a discrete choice problem. You either shoot or taser. We actually don't see any racial differences on tasers. We don't see any racial differences on any city in which we have data. Again, with the caveat being they gave us the data. Now, why is this important? It's important because you've heard several times, you have great choices. Awesome. So do a lot of us. But the key thing that's awesome about being here, I've been here for 15 years, and I will always stay here as long as ideas are my only constraint. And that's what's so wonderful about this place. Ideas truly are your only constraint. And data, but ideas are really your only constraint. And I really believe that this is the future for understanding racial inequality in America and around the world. It's using the passion that fueled our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, but using the tools of computer science and economics and artificial intelligence and those disciplines who have been set silent when it comes to racial inequality in America to truly solve these problems. We actually need you. Your generation thinks about race differently than mine. And we need your insights and your mental capabilities to finally put this old problem to bed through data, through analysis, and through objective thinking. Thanks. Enjoy your visit.